Okay, so what we're looking at here, y'all, we're going to call this Jefferson Part 2. It mainly is going to focus today on the Supreme Court under John Marshall and his importance. We're going to look at a concept called judicial review. And I'm also going to talk about impeachment and trial because that's something that's misunderstood by a lot of people. And we're going to see one of the first efforts to do it under President Jefferson. Now, looking at it here, and then, of course, probably in the second half, we're going to get to where we start talking about Aaron Burr, who, of course, is serving as vice president after Hamilton interceded and made sure that Jefferson, his enemy, won, because, remember, he hated Burr so much. I don't know if we'll get to it, but ultimately we'll get to the duel that involved Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr, and finally, Aaron Burr's conspiracy. So there's going to be a lot of Burr in here on this section. And then we'll finally conclude talking about Jefferson's foreign policy, his defense policy, and, of course, the war on the Barbary pirates. And this will take us through Jefferson, basically. For the War of 1812, y'all have kind of done those videos. I might mention a few things just to make sure that you guys have what you need to know, and then we need to move on. There's a lot to do. Also, your district test will be coming up. I hate to do those stupid things, but I will get you guys a review sheet or two that maybe you can work on over the weekend and on Monday, and then I'll give you the test on Tuesday, that district test. And then we'll kind of move on and maybe talk about some more things on Wednesday, and then I have to be gone next Thursday and Friday to a history conference. So that's kind of the plan for the next week and a half with y'all. All right, so the first thing on y'all's notes, this is the key concept, right? This is what AP expects y'all to know. Make sure you understand that John Marshall was all about federal power. He is, after all, a federalist. So his whole plan was to assert federal power over state power. Remember, Jefferson's people believed just the opposite, right? More state power, less federal power. I mean, they didn't want to go back to the old Articles of Confederation, but they definitely wanted the states to have more power than they did under this new Constitution. Also, you're going to see Marshall make the judiciary, right? That is like the Supreme Court and the federal courts, the key in determining what the Constitution means. The Constitution is a relatively short document, depending on the font you use. It could be anywhere 7, 8 pages or whatever. So there's a lot that has to be interpreted, right? And you guys remember, Federalists believed in broad interpretation. Democratic Republicans believed in strict interpretation, although we're going to see a weird kind of departure of that. Okay, the other thing is this. Here's some Marshall's key ideas. Once again, as you guys will see, John Marshall is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and as you'll see, the most important one we've had in history. First of all, it's going to help increase the power of the federal government. Increase the power of the federal government. Make sure, and I have this later on the slide, make sure you guys know when I say federal government, think of like, the FBI is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It investigates for the whole country. So when I say federal, I'm talking about the central government or the national government, but we call it the federal government. All right, his decisions, too, are all about promoting business and the economy. You may know, I've mentioned this kind of a little bit, that even though the Federalist Party kind of fades away, a lot of its ideas are the ideas of the Republican Party today. And Jefferson's Democratic Republican Party, a lot of their ideas are the ideas and supporters of the ideas of the Democratic Party today. So, for example, you'll still see the Republican Party being usually seen as the party that promotes or champions big business. They tend to support the company and the managers over, say, the workers. I'm not saying I agree or disagree, but I'm saying that's at least a perception that a lot of people have. And finally, the federal government, once again, that means central or that means national, will become, quote, more powerful. I know that's cut out by my little circle down there. Becomes more powerful at the expense of the state government. The government becomes more powerful at the expense of the state governments, okay? And that's on your notes, so you don't have to worry about typing that apparently. Okay, so now we go to the most important thing today, and that is the Supreme Court case of Marbury versus Madison. Just a couple of things here when you guys do writing. When you guys write or you type, you guys of course know you're going to be writing your test this year. Yet again, maybe next year we'll go to the actual doing it on computers. But if you guys talk about a Supreme Court case and you're typing it, you should type it and italicize it, right? You know, make the little letters kind of slanted there. And you do it for the participants, for the parties. Marbury would be italicized, Madison would be italicized. In the middle is a V. The V stands for versus, but you don't abbreviate it as VS. It's not like Kong versus Godzilla, you know, that awful movie from a few years ago. I was really looking forward to it. Man, it was so bad. But anyway, now, what if you're not typing? What do you do with Supreme Court cases? You write them out regularly, but you would underline it. So like Marbury, you would underline that. You would do nothing with the V, and then you would do Madison, and you would underline Madison. So if you're handwriting, doing it like that. If you're typing, do italics. I mean, it's just something that makes your writing look a little bit more professional, and trust me, a reader will be impressed. So who are these two dudes? Well, on the left, we have Marbury. Okay, he is the petitioner. He is the guy suing. Madison, who is at this time Secretary of State under Jefferson, later, of course, to be president. Madison is the guy being sued, okay, the defendant, so to speak. And the case is in 1803, the same year as the Louisiana Purchase. Now, the background to the case is not as important as the principle that the case establishes, but I think it is kind of interesting, right? When I was in my pre-law classes in college, I always loved learning about the background. I guess that's the history guy in me. But Marbury was one of those midnight judges that Adams appointed. You know, he appointed lots and lots of these guys. And for some reason, and I don't know if he was the only one or not, but for some reason, y'all, Marbury didn't get what was called his commission. Now, the commission, just like in the military, means basically, you know, your job, the thing that you're supposed to do, basically your job offer. That wasn't delivered to him. And he knew he was supposed to become a justice of the peace, but he did not get this. Well, before anything could be done, Adams was gone. And if you guys remember, Adams didn't hang around, man. He split and he went back to Quincy, Massachusetts, and went ahead and left, or Braintree, I guess is what it was called then. Now, so the guy doesn't get his job. So being a good American, when you're unhappy, don't whine about it. Do something about it. Sue. And of course, that's what he did. Now, sadly, he didn't have Jim Adler, the tough, smart lawyer, the Texas Hammer, money for your pain and suffering, money that you deserve. Y'all ever see the tough, smart lawyer? Yeah. He's not so tough or smart anymore. He's like he's got his son doing all the work now. But anyway, so he didn't have Jim Adler, but he sued. Now, in cases involving this kind of thing, the Supreme Court had what was called original jurisdiction. It went directly to them. You didn't go through like federal courts and appellate courts and district courts and local and state courts. It went right directly to the United States Supreme Court. So he sues, basically demanding the new Secretary of State, James Madison. Secretary of States did this kind of stuff back then instead of just foreign affairs like they do today. He demanded James Madison get him the commission. So he sues. Now, there was a power that the Supreme Court had that they could order Madison to give him the commission. They could issue something, and this is a little bit more info than you need, but a writ of mandamus. This would require you to give him the commission. Now, in a little bit of kind of weird conspiracy, I don't know if you guys are conspiracy theorists. I love studying conspiracy. Doesn't mean I believe in them, but I love reading about them. But there is this conspiracy, and it goes like this. John Marshall had been the previous Secretary of State, okay? It had been his job to get the commissions to people. And your conspiracy people say, you know what I think happened? John Marshall, knowing he was going to become a Supreme Court justice and knowing he would probably have this case come to him, intentionally didn't get him the commission. And then, of course, they had a deal that he would sue, and then, of course, by him suing, the court would come to him. Now he's Chief Justice, and he could make this powerful ruling. I think that's giving even somebody as smart as John Marshall a little too much credit. And in the deal, y'all, what's his name never gets his job, and I don't know whatever ends up happening to Marbury. Okay, now, John Marshall was the new Supreme Court judge. And speaking of which, y'all, I don't know if you guys know this term, but it's called recusing. R-E-C-U-S-I-N-G. I think that's the way it's spelled. Now, if I'm a judge and I have anything to do with the plaintiff, that is the person suing, or the defendant, or even their lawyers, like I know some of the people involved, I am supposed to not do the case. Why would they have you not be involved in the case if you knew some of the people involved? Might you be favorable to them? Yeah, right? And so he should have excused himself because, after all, he was the guy who hadn't delivered the commission. But no, John Marshall's not going to recuse himself. He stayed involved, okay? So Marshall knows I can go ahead and try to tell Madison to give him the commission, but at this point, y'all, the Supreme Court is not considered a very important branch. And as you guys will see in another Marshall case, when John Marshall made a case against Andrew Jackson basically said, you know what, you made your decision, now enforce it. And Jackson basically ignored him in one of the Cherokee cases, right? So, you know, Marshall understands I can order Madison to give him the commission, but Madison's going to blow me off. So what do? Well, Marshall doesn't therefore get the job for Marbury. So Marbury, he's forgotten. He doesn't get his job, but something bigger happens. Marshall says, you know, Marbury, I'd like to give you the job. I'd like to issue a writ of mandamus, but the law that would give me the right to issue this writ is not constitutional. It was created by the Judiciary Act of 1789, and the Judiciary Act of 1789 was unconstitutional. They gave Congress too many powers that Congress doesn't have. Now, this is weird because, remember, y'all, Marshall is a Federalist. He usually believes in broad interpretation of the Constitution. But in this case, he's saying, you know what? Congress doesn't have the power to give me the power to do this. So you know what? I am saying that the Judiciary Act itself is unconstitutional. Now, this is a big deal because he is basically striking down a law made by Congress and signed by the president, y'all. This had been signed by George Washington. He was a big fan of Washington, wrote a great biography of George Washington. He's basically saying, sorry, unconstitutional. And what he's going to set up, and this is something you guys will learn about next year in your AP or even your regular U.S. government, it's something called the ladder of the laws. Now, you guys know when people make laws, sometimes those laws might contradict each other. You know, Houston makes laws, right? What if the laws Houston makes contradict state laws that are made in Austin by our state legislature? Well, which one wins out, do y'all think? Houston laws or state laws? State laws are considered more important. What if a state law or a Houston law violates the Texas Constitution? Well, guess what? The state laws have to give way. Houston laws have to give way. What if our government passes laws, federal laws, that contradict the Texas Constitution? Guess what? Texas Constitution has to give way to federal laws. What if federal laws contradict the so-called highest law in the land, the U.S. Constitution? Guess what? Federal laws have to give way. So in other words, y'all, any action by a president, any law by any branch or constitution lower than the Constitution can be thrown out as unconstitutional because, quote, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Anything violating that Constitution will be declared null and void. What this establishes, y'all, is what's known as judicial review. Everybody say that word together. Judicial, let's say judicial review. Judicial review. And this means the Supreme Court, as well as the federal court, even state courts can declare laws beneath them to be unconstitutional. But only the U.S. Constitution and only the Supreme Court and federal courts, y'all, can declare federal laws and state constitutions and stuff be unconstitutional. So before y'all go to lunch, I'm going to go ahead and play this little thing for you.
It's Frank J. once again with World of Knowledge. Today's topic, the Supreme Court case, Marbury versus Madison. Before the decision was rendered on February 24th, 1803, the Supreme Court had little function. Most days you could find the Supreme Court justices out front playing hacky sack. But when Chief Justice John Marshall announced his decision, all of that was changed forever.
I declare that the Supreme Court has the power of judicial review. In fact,
it has supreme power over everything. I declare power over all that is, over the moon and the stars. All shall bow before the power of the Supreme Court. Our reach is infinite, and our judgments shall be unquestioned.
Excuse me, this is Marbury. I thought this case was about whether I could get that appointment that Adams gave me.
Silence, fool! How dare you speak to a god such as I?
Public feared the Supreme Court's new power and sent their president, Thomas Jefferson.
I shall put a stop to this. Chief Justice Marshall, your reign of terror has come to an end.
What can you do about it, puny mortal?
Using the power of checks and balances, I shall draw you into this magical stone of judicial restraint.
Jefferson succeeded, but the stone became implanted into the building of the Supreme Court, and it continues to give evil power to the Supreme Court justices even to this day. This has been Frank J., and now you're just a little bit smarter.
There you go. Okay. Alrighty, y'all. Have a good lunch. See you guys in a little bit. Okay, y'all. So we're continuing here with your notes, going to the battle with the judicial branch, right? Basically the battle with the courts. And that's the top of page 6. Now, remember, we've talked about this a lot, but you guys remember when Adams left the presidency, he was not a very happy camper, and he'd appointed a lot of judges. These judges weren't just judges on the Supreme Court, but judges, I guess, federal courts. I don't know if we had district courts yet or whatever. And of course, the most famous is the one we've just talked about, and that'll be John Marshall. Now, the thing to remember, I've said this a couple of times, is that these judges serve for life. You can't remove them unless it's for so-called high crimes and misdemeanors or treason. Basically, they can be removed for the same things that the President of the United States and members of the executive branch can be. That is high crimes, misdemeanors, or treason. And as we'll talk later, treason is something very, very hard to prove. Now, these judges would serve long, long after the Federalist Party had died. Federalist Party, y'all, basically dies after the War of 1812. If you guys read the notes, you know that at one point, Federalists up in Hartford, Connecticut, at a convention there, actually talked about seceding, that is, leaving the United States. And then when news came of the victory at the Battle of New Orleans, these Federalists looked like traitors. You also had Alexander Hamilton get shot and killed. He was the brains and the leader of the Federalists, and with that, the Federalists died. However, y'all, the Federalist Party continued to have great influence in how they controlled the judgeships. Now, as I just mentioned, the most important of these judges was the leader of the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Marshall. Ironically, y'all, John Marshall was the cousin of Thomas Jefferson. Doesn't mean they liked each other. These guys definitely weren't kissing cousins, if you know what I mean. I never understood what that means. It just sounds really gross. But anyway, it's a phrase and an Elvis movie. Now, John Marshall served for 34 years on the bench. By that, I mean he served as the Chief Justice for 34 years. So think about it, y'all. What is that, like 1790 or no, 1800 to like 1834? My gosh, y'all, that's almost as long as Mr. D has been teaching, which is really, how long is that? Too long. Okay, sorry. Now, why do I have the Liberty Bell on this slide? Because when John Marshall did the decent thing and finally died, they rang the Liberty Bell. Now, the Liberty Bell, y'all, had gotten its name because after the Declaration of Independence was announced, this bell at Independence Hall, as we would now call it, was rung. So it became a very important national symbol, and it still is. I'm kind of surprised when Americans today don't know what the Liberty Bell is. Now, if you know about the Liberty Bell, you also know that the Liberty Bell is cracked. So when John Marshall died and they had his funeral, they got the Liberty Bell out, they rung the Liberty Bell, and guess what? It cracked. I don't know if you guys can see the crack here, but it's not a very good bell if it cracks, but hey, it did. Now, I'm kind of obscuring it here with my little picture, but John Marshall, y'all, almost single-handedly made the judicial branch equal to the executive and legislative branches. To be honest, and as you heard in that little kind of radio audio thing, the Supreme Court judicial branch was kind of looked down upon. They didn't have a whole lot to do. They don't have what's called original jurisdiction in many things. It's usually what's called appellate. You have to go to other courts. Oh, and there's something I'm going to mention here in just a sec, too, about judicial review that I forgot to do. Now, Marshall was a very, very strong Federalist. Pretty much when he ruled, y'all, it was always in a way that made the Federalists more powerful. In other words, made the federal government more powerful. And as I said, and this is going to take a little bit of explanation, but it's important for you guys to know both today and for the future, okay? And that has to do with impeachment. Now, a lot of Americans, when they get mad at the president, whether it's Biden or whether it was Trump, you immediately hear calls to, we should just impeach him. Okay, and that is used almost like, well, if we impeach them, automatically they're out of office. But that's not the way it works, okay? If you guys or Mr. D were ever believed to commit a crime, hopefully that won't happen, and the police arrest us, do we go to trial immediately? No. What do they have to do? They have to charge us. They will take us before what's called a grand jury. Evidence will be presented that suggests that we might be guilty. It's not proof, but in other words, they give enough evidence to the judge and to the grand jury where the grand jury and the judge decide, you know what, we think there's enough to have a trial. But if the grand jury and the judge listen to what evidence they have and they say, you know, we don't think there's enough here, then it's over. You and I don't get charged and we don't have a trial. So if we're looking at the executive or the judicial branch, they first have to be impeached. What does that mean? They first have to be charged, just like you or I would. Now, to impeach a president, to impeach a member of the Supreme Court, is not a hard thing to do. It requires only half of the House of Representatives to do so, right? Only half, or half plus one. In other words, just over 50%. If you have 200 people in Congress, 101 would decide, okay? And if you control a House like right now, Republicans control the House of Representatives by a few seats. And for part of Trump's administration, Democrats controlled, especially the second half of his presidency, Democrats control the House of Representatives. All you got to do is get your party to stick together, and they can vote to impeach. Now, in our history, y'all, we've had several Supreme Court justices impeached, and a few, I'm trying to remember how many, but we've had a few maybe actually removed. As far as presidents go, there have been 4 impeachments in American history. The first, as you guys will see, second semester, or the end of first semester, is Andrew Johnson. He was impeached. Then, of course, we waited all the way until the late 90s, and we impeached Bill Clinton. And then with President Trump, there were 2 impeachments right at the end of his presidency. Did those guys all keep their job? Yes, they all stayed in office, right? And so what happened is once you're charged, the House of Representatives charges you, but then we get the hard part. The hard part, y'all, is the trial. The trial is held in the Senate. Now, when you and I, if we ever get arrested and charged with a criminal act, the jury is made up, does anybody know how many people? 12 people. 12 people, that's it. And it has to be unanimous, right? If even one person their mind cannot be changed, you and I are free, right? If one person, 11 say you're guilty, and one says you're not, and that one person won't come around, it's over. You're found not guilty. Doesn't mean you're innocent, but you're not convicted. Okay, in the Senate, it's a little bit different. In the Senate, all 100 people in the Senate, right, will try you, okay? Now, right now, our Senate is pretty evenly divided, like 50 Democrats, 50 Republicans. So, if, for example, because there are Republicans that are talking about impeaching Biden, would that be hard? No, not if all Republicans vote together. They only need 50%. Now, however, if you tried Biden, just like Trump was tried twice in the Senate, you have to get 2/3 of them. So, to convict Biden, y'all, you would need the 50 Republicans, and you would need to get 17 Democrats to go ahead and vote to convict a fellow Democrat. That's just impossible to do. So we have had 4 presidential impeachments. Not one of them, y'all, has led to a conviction in the Senate and removal, okay? So it's hard to do. Trump went through 2 impeachments. Both times was found not guilty. Why? Because they couldn't get enough Democrats to join they couldn't get enough Republicans to join the Democrats to convict him. And I suspect if indeed they do go through with the impeachment of Biden, it will be very hard to get 17 or 18 Democrats to join Republicans to convict him. And that's assuming the Republicans all stick together. And Republicans don't seem to be very good at sticking together. Democrats do a lot better voting in a block, like all voting and agreeing, whereas you see Republicans often kind of splitting away, okay? So, it's kind of frustrating for people who think that we should do it. So why do I bring that all up? Well, it's important for you guys to know how the impeachment thing goes, because a lot of people think impeachment means being removed from office. And by the way, if you do get convicted, really about the only punishment you get is you get kicked out of office. I think you might lose your pension or emolument is whatever they call it, but you don't go to jail. If somebody wants to go to jail or wants you to go to jail, they're going to have to try you in a real civilian court. Now, we did have one president who did resign. Now, Richard Nixon, y'all, resigned even before being impeached, right? Back in 1973, they were doing impeachment proceedings, thinking about it, and in 74, Richard Nixon said, "You can't impeach me because I quit," and he left. Now, he ultimately would be pardoned, but there were people, y'all, who wanted Nixon to actually go to jail. It wasn't enough that he just quit. maybe he should go to jail, okay? I mean, there's all kinds of crazy stories I can tell y'all about some of the impeachments. They did impeach one guy one time after he resigned. It was kind of weird. And if you remember with Bush, Trump, they continued this stuff even after he was out of office. So it's kind of bizarre how we use that. So why do I bring that up yet again? Jefferson tried to do it to one of the judges by the name of Samuel Chase, who was on the Supreme Court. I don't know if he was kind of maybe testing and getting ready to go after John Marshall, but they went after Samuel Chase. The Democratic Republicans were able to get the Federalist Samuel Chase impeached. But of course, when they went over to do the trial in the Senate to actually find him guilty and remove him from the office, it failed, as it usually does, because people tend to vote on party lines. Okay, there was something I said I was going to tell y'all as well about how judicial review works, because even people who know about judicial review often get this wrong. A lot of people will look at it and go, all right, well, they passed a law. That law is really stupid. They need to declare it unconstitutional. It doesn't work that way. It's not like, hey, we passed a law. Congress passed it. The president signed it. Now the Supreme Court needs to rule on it. It doesn't work that way. Somebody has to be hurt by the law. Somebody has to be threatened or go to jail or pay a fine to challenge it. Like, for example, abortion, okay? Back in the 1970s, a woman wanted an abortion in Texas. Texas law at the time did not allow her to do it. Now, she was given a pseudonym, not a real name, but she was given the pseudonym of Roe. The man facing her, okay, was one of the attorney generals or something in Texas by the name of Wade, okay? Now, she wanted an abortion. Basically, he said no. The state of Texas doesn't allow it. She took him to court. Now, this took months, y'all, and I don't know, to be honest, I hate to admit it, I don't know what the fate was. I think maybe she went to another state and got an abortion, or maybe she had, I don't know quite what all happened with it. But anyway, it reached the Supreme Court. Now, because this woman was being hurt by the law, she could sue and it would reach the Supreme Court. I'll give you another, and eventually the court said that no state could ban an abortion in the first 3 months of pregnancy. Now later there would be a Dobbs decision last year or so that kind of modified that, but that's kind of out of the scope of this class. Here's another example. Back in the 1980s, you still had a lot of World War II veterans, like my dad and stuff, were still around and kicking. And there were a lot of Americans who, in their anger at our country, burned the American flag. Now, this angered a lot of veterans. I mean, I don't like seeing the American flag being burned. And so in Congress, y'all, they passed basically a law to make flag burning illegal. Now, I knew, most people knew at the time, that probably wouldn't pass what we call constitutional muster. Because whether you and I like flag burning or not, it is a type of expression. It is a type of freedom of speech. And if you try to limit free speech that isn't physically hurting anybody, isn't really threatening anybody, you're going to find it's kind of hard to prove. But the Supreme Court just couldn't jump in and say, hey, that's unconstitutional. What had to happen? So as soon as this law was passed, y'all, there was a member of the Communist Party of Texas. He went to the Capitol, and literally on the Capitol steps, y'all, he burned a flag. Well, what happened? He got arrested. Why did he want to do that? He wanted to get arrested, y'all, so that the case would eventually make its way to the Supreme Court, which it did, and to no one's surprise, the Supreme Court said, you know what, a lot of people may not like the burning of the flag, but it is protected expression. It is protected freedom of speech. And they struck down the law, and the dude was allowed to go free. That is judicial review. So just please understand, it's not an automatic thing. It might take a while after we pass a law for it to be tested at the Supreme Court level. Federal courts can do it. Even state courts, y'all, can declare state laws unconstitutional. All right, so let's look at Marshall here. Marshall was a champion of national sovereignty, right? Basically, federal government always trumps, always rules out over state governments, right? He was a champion of capitalism. As a Federalist, he championed capitalism. Remember, this was one thing that Democratic Republicans and the Federalists both agreed. They just had subtle differences. Now, his Supreme Court decisions, and hopefully you guys have done those videos that I gave you to do of Adam Norris, where he talks about the most famous Marshall decisions. Some of the common things they have. First of all, they are always for very, very broad interpretation of the Constitution. Liberal interpretation, right, that we talked about. They favored implied powers. Remember, just because the Constitution doesn't say you can do it, doesn't mean you can do it. Basically, you can do whatever the heck you want to do unless the Constitution says you can't. Also, you guys would see in the case of Gibbons versus Ogden that we'll look at tomorrow, or you guys will read about, that was a big decision as well too, expanding the Commerce Clause. Also, of course, they believed that the government had no business getting involved with American business, except maybe to help them. They did not want to do anything to restrain free trade. That by free trade, I don't mean trade with other countries, because they did restrain that with tariffs. But I mean to restrain Americans from trading with each other, okay? And of course, he's going to champion this new federal government that we had by championing things like national sovereignty. I've already mentioned that, over states' rights. National sovereignty over states' rights. The capitalist system, okay? He strengthened the capitalist system, right? And on the next slide, I'm going to include some of those particular things that make the capitalist system what it is, okay? All righty. Now, on to the next slide here. Now, these are some of the pillars of capitalism that Marshall strengthened. And you and I live in a world where most of this is still followed today, okay? Your right to own property. Now, we do have some limits. If I own property and use it in such a way that I hurt other people, then you can limit it. If I decide at my house to start, burning stuff and, have a factory there and pollute things, then, they can do stuff to limit that. But for the most part, if I'm not hurting anybody, I can do whatever the heck I want with my private property. Government can take it if they pay me a fair wage or a fair price, if they need it for something like to build a highway or whatever, something called eminent domain. You and I have the right to free enterprise. If we want to start a business, if we want to do a certain job, we have the right to do that job. Now, you and I know that for way too long in our country, certain ethnic groups and even, sexes were forbidden to do certain jobs. But once again, this is the goal. And we've come a lot closer to realizing that goal. But basically, you have the right to do a job if you can meet the qualifications. I mean, I can't go in and I'm going to be a brain doctor, and I ain't done no brain work, but I'm going to do it. No, you can't do that. We can have some limits on it. You have the right to make a profit from your business, right? We can tax that profit, but we just can't seize that profit. We can't keep you from making money, okay? So these are three important pillars of what we today call free enterprise, private enterprise, or capitalism, or even laissez-faire, which you guys have heard about before. And you guys will learn more about that in economics class next year. But Marshall, y'all, was a big supporter of all these things. And so this went hand in hand with him, with having a republic. You also would have these aspects of American capitalism. Now, his most important decisions, and you guys have read about these, or you've seen the videos. One is Marbury versus Madison that we just talked about, okay? The second one is McCulloch versus Maryland. I don't know if I'm going to go over those in a lot of detail. I can't remember if I have stuff about them on a PowerPoint or not. But McCulloch versus Maryland, y'all, involved the Bank of the United States. So maybe just write a couple little things down about this case. The bus. Now, the second Bank of the United States, y'all, was chartered in Maryland, in Baltimore, if I'm not wrong. And what happened there was Maryland tried to tax the Bank of the United States. Now, some people believe they were trying to tax them to such an extent that they were trying to destroy the Bank of the United States. This was a way to get rid of the Bank of the United States. But what people were really asking about in this case is, does the Bank of the United States have a right to exist? Because remember, Jefferson and Madison initially believed there is no right to have a Bank of the United States. Well, what John Marshall decided in this case was, not only is there a right to have the Bank of the United States, but Maryland has no right to try to tax the Bank of the United States. His famous phrase, and in my pre-law classes, man, I use this one a lot. The power to tax involves the power to destroy. The power to tax involves the power to destroy. If we let a state government start taxing instruments of the federal government, they could basically tax them into oblivion. This is one reason, y'all, that churches or mosques or synagogues or temples are not taxed by our government. Some people think that's kind of unfair. Some of those things make quite a bit of money. But the idea is, if our government could tax churches, if it could tax mosques, it could literally tax them out of existence. The third case that you guys will need to know is Gibbons versus Ogden. Now, that case, y'all, which you can read about in the comic book thing I gave y'all, involves a monopoly. Now, a monopoly, if you remember the game Monopoly, okay, means a single seller. The real goal of the game of Monopoly is to be the only guy or gal left. You want to run everybody else to bankrupt, right? It's not like, let's play for 2 hours, then we'll count and see who has the most money. That's wussopoly. Real monopoly, y'all, is you drive everybody out of business to where you're the monopoly. You are the single seller. You are the monopoly. All right, so back in the day, y'all, they had granted one business, a state had granted a monopoly to one company to basically have the rights to ferry people on a steamboat back and forth between two states, New York and New Jersey, I think it was. So this company alone had the right to do it. Now, if only one company has the right to do it, y'all, they can make a really big profit. John Marshall shoots it down and says, because you're trading between New York and New Jersey, this is interstate commerce, and only the federal government can engage in interstate commerce. All right, we'll stop there.